Good morning. Welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. There's a nice moon shot. I'm up really early getting ready to come up to Crest Creek here in the High C Hills here in Idaho. Going to share some marvelous ideas on the kind and nature of being that God is in the scriptures, and share with you the history of the type of thinking that occurred concerning God. We can actually now trace the beginnings of the apostasy, believe it or not. How the nature and understanding of God changed. We know who the culprits are. We know when. We know how. And it's an intriguing subject, but that's not going to be my subject. My main subject is going to be on what the scriptures teach about God. So come with me on this wonderful adventure. This is going to be a several-part series because, of course, one can't elaborate on God in just 10 minutes and do any kind of justice to it. So I'm going to give you some scriptures and some themes on the history of the development of the type of being God is. This is Crest Creek, where I'll be spending the next couple hours in the Crest Creek area, enjoying discussing the subject of the scriptural understanding of God. It's a beautiful spot here. There's very little question now, based on the analysis of the Greek in the New Testament and the history of the early Christian thinking, that God was a physical, embodied deity, along with His Holy Son. The Scriptures are replete with this imagery, but nowhere more powerfully than in Jesus' own words. Oh, I'm up above the Snake River here in southeast Idaho, and there's a new book, relatively new, about 2005, the newest, most up-to-date information, called The Early Christians in Disarray. This is about contemporary LDS perspectives on the Christian apostasy, edited by Noel Reynolds for 2005. This is the text that David Paulson has a very excellent article, Divine Embodiment, the Earliest Christian Understanding of God. And this is an updated version of a series of articles he wrote in the Harvard Theological Review on Origen and Augustine, the early Christian nervousness, the embodied deity. They were reluctant witnesses to the fact that the early Christians believed that God had a glorified immortal body as well as His Son. It's an intriguing article. It's a long article, so I'm going to do this in several parts and share with you Paulson's really excellent research on the history of how the understanding of God changed through the first 4 centuries. And we would argue this is the beginning of the apostasy, because if you lose your understanding of the character and kind of being God is, then you've apostatized. It was a revealed knowledge in the scriptures. But because later on the adaptation of Neoplatonic philosophy, Greek philosophy, some of the early Christian fathers began to argue against the embodiment of God. And Paulson traces this history that I want to share with you. It's utterly intriguing. Looks like the winds are coming up. I hope this doesn't goof up my audio too much on this video. In the meantime, enjoy the beautiful Snake River for a moment. Now there's a phenomenal piece of Artemisia tridentata. That's the scientific name for sagebrush. Look at the size of this thing. Hopefully I won't get into any rattlesnakes. They say there's rattlesnakes around here, but I mean, that thing is way up there. That's nice. The hills here in the high sea area, they're loaded with Artemisia tridentata. It's what they call the sagebrush, and then the Persia tridentata is called the bitterbrush. Let's see if I can find some here. I do believe this is the Persia tridentata right there. I do believe that's it. It's beautiful when it's in bloom. That's the bitterbrush. That's what the animals browse on in the winter. You got twigs and leaves and rodents, deer, mice, chipmunks, pocket gophers, whatever. There's an enormous amount of wildlife that these hills support. Sage grouse mostly just dwell on the sagebrush. Artemisia tridentata. It's fascinating, isn't it? Now, though in the first vision of Joseph Smith, God and Jesus Christ, God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith as two immortal, glorified, resurrected men. And it was a radical departure from the Christianity of Joseph Smith's day, no question about that. But this so-called innovation, this new doctrine, this new understanding of deity, Paulson notes, was not declared completely new, unknown for 19 centuries. But it was a restoration of a belief that was had before. So by analyzing the scriptures and the early Christian movement, we find this same teaching of an embodied God. Now, Paulson notes that the earliest Christians believed God to be embodied is admitted by the noted church historian Adolf Harnack in his History of Dogma. He says, writing of the first century believers, Harnack notes, God was naturally conceived and represented as corporeal by uncultured Christians. Notice his bias here. If you believe in a corporeal deity, you're an uncultured Christian. We have a response to that. Tertullian also believed this doctrine, and he was no slouch. He was very sophisticated, intelligent, and intellectual. He knew his philosophy, he knew his scriptures. But our modern day bias, uncultured Christians believe a crude anthropomorphism. But it's not these alone that had this doctrine, as the later controversies prove. In other words, Origen contra Melito, Tertullian and the Anima. In the case of the cultured, the idea of a corporality of God may be traced back to Stoic influences. So see, even the Stoics believe this doctrine of a deity who was embodied. And in the case of the uncultured, popular ideas co-opted with the sayings of the Old Testament literally understood and the impression of the apocalyptic images. This is fascinating. He further concedes, this is Harnack here in the 2nd century, realistic eschatological ideas no doubt continue to foster in wide circles the popular idea that God had a form and a kind of a corporeal existence. Here's more of Cress Creek. They say it's warmed by the natural springs coming out of the ground. It's year-round warm, and that allows for the watercress to grow. We can touch the water and feel that it's lukewarm. It's a beautiful creek. Really nice. The reason that's important is because I can do what God can do in that respect, because He is anthropomorphic. And He can feel the warmth of the water. And if you think that's crude, if you think the anthropomorphism of God is crude, like Adolf Harnack, just consider Jesus in the New Testament. We are made after the image of God. The early Christians understood that concept literally, just as we LDS do. It's a beautiful doctrine. Harnack also noticed something real interesting. He said there are several possible sources for primitive Christian belief. Notice his pejorative, primitive. These people think in crude anthropomorphic terms, therefore they're primitive. Nothing of the sort, but that's our modern scholarly bias.